right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I wanna give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rachak. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations unto the Akim I heard pushing this gospel in truth and sincerity to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall put on your houses. This is Brother Quanah Watt from the Arizona Great Millstone Camp. Come back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. And it's going to be a quick in transit lesson. Again, just pointing out the fact that America is being, pushed right out of, these trade markets. Starting back with, Saudi Arabia. Ultimately they had a 50-year deal with America. Making it to where they had to sell or trade the oil, right, in, the petrodollar, the American currency. And as we came to the end of that deal, Saudi Arabia did not want to renew that deal, right? Because them having that deal would ultimately keep the dollar in power, right? It would keep the dollar, strong, right? But we're seeing a lot of these nations, right, starting to basically stray away from, the American dollar, or just any kind of deal or trade or agreement with America, right? As you see right here, it says China rejects soybeans buys from BRICS countries. Now, for those that know, right, BRICS, right, is a conglomerate of nations, right, which the name itself is an acronym for the major nations, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They've ultimately had an agenda to where they want to remove the dollar from, being that main currency that the world uses, right? Straying away, what they call it, a de-dollarization. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so lucky I got, on my way to destination, but nonetheless, they're moving towards what they call de-dollarization, right? Which means that the American dollar again is being pushed out, which means America as a whole is being pushed out. And really this situation where China is ultimately rejecting, American soybeans or purchasing American soybeans is because of this trade war, right, that Trump ultimately has been having, right, going back and forth with China, right? As it says right here in the first sentence, it says China is refusing to buy U.S. soybeans and has cut imports due to tariffs and trade wars. Now, when you go into it, which I did a little bit of digging, China roughly has or purchases anywhere, between 40 to 50% of America's soybean production, right? China ultimately, purchases it, which is a huge chunk, right? Which, when you think about it, or when you go into the numbers, when you dig into the numbers, right? America roughly, produces, about 20, or China ultimately, buys about 10 to 12 billion dollars worth of, the soybean market, which ultimately, is around 25 billion per year annually, right? That's ultimately, sold or traded, so China has about roughly half of that, right? So about 10 to 12 billion, which isn't a lot, right? We're talking about, 0.1% or less than 0.1%, of, America's GDP, right? So it's not a lot, but see, this is a growing trend that we're starting to see, right? Which ultimately can, bloom into bigger, resources that ultimately America produces, again, such as soybean, right, that is ultimately going to be pushed out, that's not going to be bought by these other nations. So this is definitely, a snowball that is starting to roll downhill, right, and pick up steam, right? Again, these nations, right, these BRIC nations, which is basically the Eastern version of NATO, if you will, right? And they're not having it, right? They don't want to make a deal with America. They don't want to, ultimately have any kind of, dealings with America anymore, right? Well, at one point they were, right? At one point they were, American dollar was, it still is to a certain degree, man, right? The American dollar is still on top. America still is, that powerhouse, but it's starting to dwindle, right? It's starting to lose that steam, It says the communist country has not booked a single shipment from U.S. suppliers this season. The development is proving costly for U.S.-based farmers, right? That's going to affect the farmers right here in America, man, because they're going to be, they're going to have all this crop and it's not going to be sold, right? Which is going to cause them to, lower the prices that they sell it for, which means they're not going to receive, as much, profit, that they once did. And it's going to hurt their, their crops next year, right? In the years to come afterwards, man, right? This is a huge step that China is taking, right? To ultimately, basically push America out, because this is ultimately the plan, right? America to be pushed out, and either Russia or China, right, to try to take over as the new powerhouse or the new ruling nation, which we know is not going to happen, right? We understand that Yahweh Bashim Al Shai, has his own agenda, right, and it doesn't involve, right, these other nations, right, being in rulership or taking over after America, right? We know that the nation Israel has next, right, pursuing what is that, 2nd Ezra, the 6th chapter, right, the 9th verse, Esau at the end of the world, and Jacob is the beginning of it that follow it, right? Meaning the Israelites have next, man, once this place goes down, and we're seeing it go down, right? Different nations are starting to sit here and not utilize, or not, basically pointing out that they don't need America anymore, right? They don't need the dollar anymore, right? More and more nations are trading in different currencies, It says that so what happened, right? It's about halfway through the first paragraph. It says, it turns out that China is now buying soybean from South American countries, Argentina and Brazil, which again, Brazil being, right, one of the BRICS nations, right? I don't necessarily know if Argentina is, right? But Brazil is, right? It says the BRICS member is allowing the country to pay the Chinese yuan for settlement. So they're using the Chinese currency, the yuan, instead of the dollar, right? Which weakens the dollar, which weakens the power that America has over these different nations, man, right? Trump and his administration put, tariffs on 90 plus countries, thinking that they're going to ultimately get their way, but we're starting to see that is really starting to backfire, on Trump and his administration, really the America as a whole, right? Let's drop down. It says BRICS member Brazil is sending soybeans to China and is accepting the Chinese yuan for payments. The U.S. farmers are now facing overflowing bins of soybeans with flat prices. President Donald Trump announced that he will raise the issue directly with Xi Jinping over the refusal, which is not going to work, right? They're not going to give a shit. They're going to be like, hey, well, guess what, man? If we got to pay a little bit more than we used to with Brazil or with Argentina than we did with you, hell, it's a lot cheaper than paying those prices and then now having to pay the prices with, the tariff, being increased, right? Because who knows, it could be a lot more that they have to pay, right, to ultimately buy, American, made products, than it is to buy them from, Brazil or Argentina. And we know that America ultimately has, a whole bunch of the GMO foods anyways, man. So they might just be getting a better product, right, from Brazil or from Argentina, Not to say that, Monsanto or GMO, crops are not being grown out there, right? But it's a hell of a lot less than it is in America, right? Damn near everything in America is GMO, man. It says trade tensions are increasingly becoming worrisome between the two economically powerful nations. And with this move right here, man, it just shows you that these nations don't need America. They don't need, right? Nor do they care about the tariffs or anything like that that's being waged on them or being increased. They don't care anymore, man. America is losing, right? America's losing power, and you can read, the rest right on your own. I'm just going to hop into the scriptures, man. I've been talking a lot, which is, this is, an in transit, so bear with me. This is Jeremiah 51 and verse 7. It says, Babylon had been a golden cup in Yahweh's hand, right? America has been that top nation, right, for so long. America, and again, to a certain degree, right, America still is that top nation. You would have to have a lot, of countries basically saying we're not dealing with America anymore, or a majority of the country saying we're not dealing with America anymore, in order for America to really go down like that. America still is, that powerhouse, right? It's just losing steam. It's losing, power, if you will, over these different nations, right? Because it says right here, it says that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, meaning, that philosophy, that Babylon, that Babylonish, Roman, lifestyle, right? You got McDonald's and, Moism and harlotry, right? In every nation now, man. Because that's what was pushed, in America, right? That was the lifestyle that was pushed into America, and all these nations, right, drank of that wine, right? As it says right here, therefore the nations are mad. And when you go into that word mad, it's like, that word mad, it says what? Strong's H 1984 halal, meaning what? To make, it says to make a fool of, right here, to make a fool of, make into a fool, right? These nations. Then it says what? To act madly, act like a madman, right? So when they were drinking, that wine, right? They were, basically partaking in being bugged out, partaking in being, looking like some damn fools right along with America, man. But now they're starting to see that. Now they're starting to say, hey, everything that America has pushed, everything that America, has ultimately, made and said that it was, good, or it was great, or, that this is the lifestyle and this is how we need to act. Now the nations are saying, nah, we don't want no part of that. Right? They don't want no part of that. And that's becoming a, a growing trend even within, America's allies, man. Right? With the way that America is moving with, when they put sanctions, right, going back to the beginning, of the war with Russia and Ukraine, when America ultimately put sanctions on Russia, a lot of the European nations, more specifically France, Germany, Spain, a lot of them were saying, hey, don't put those sanctions on Russia because that's going to heavily affect, the European economy, right? 40% of the European economy runs off of, Russian oil, right? Russian fuel, And what did America do? America did it anyways, right? America basically said to its allies, hey, F you, And now we're starting to see, right, the way that America is moving, right? A lot of these European nations are just not having it anymore, man. And moving, right, without the consent or approval of America itself, because they're starting to realize that America just ain't it, You know, hold on one second. Right, so let me go back. Right, America ain't got that power no more, right? It says, verse 8, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed, and this is where America is, heading to. Right, the American economy, right, that American, standard, right, is being destroyed, and soon, right, it's gonna be, America as a whole, right, being completely destroyed, right, via ICBM nuclear missiles, right? It says Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. How for her take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed. And Biden and his administration, Trump and his administration have tried, to do everything that they can to try to mitigate the situation, right? To make American, Biden had the Build Back Better. Trump got the Make America Great Again. And the different, policies and legislation and things that they ultimately do to try to make that possible. It just ain't working. Verse 9, it says, we would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed, meaning they're not working, right? Those mitigations, right, that they try to ultimately, implement, they're just not working, right? It says, we would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go everyone into his own country. And you're starting to see more and more people, right? Hell, even celebrities, right, leave, America and say that living in these other nations is more peaceful. Everything's not a competition. Everything's not, so corrupt and whatnot. People are actually leaving America, man, and not dealing with America anymore, man. Because of how corrupt it is, because of how, evil and wicked it is here, man. It says, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven and is lifted up even to the skies. That's right, man. Right? And America is soon going to be judged, right, for all the crime that it committed, right? All the wickedness that is pushed in the earth, destroying the earth, where America has been the standard of wickedness for so long, right? And that's why it says in Amos, why don't we grab this and close out? This is Amos 8 in verse 9. It says, it's like Amos 9 and 8, right? This is Amos chapter 9, verse 8. It says, behold, the eyes of the Lord Yahweh, Ba'ashim Yahushai, are upon the sinful kingdom, right, which we know is America, right? And I will destroy it from off the face of the earth, right? Again, by way of via ICBM nuclear missile, right? Saving that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, saith the Lord Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. We're talking about the elect, right? The Lord is not going to destroy the elect. He's going to deliver the elect, from that noisome pestilence, as we read in Psalm the 91st chapter, which is America being destroyed via ICBM nuclear missiles, man. Right? That's that noisome pestilence, man. That's what's coming to America, man. Again, as we've seen right now, the American economy and the American power, right, over these different nations, right, is starting to, wane. It's starting to, crumble, if you will. Right? Which, again, is going to lead to America as a whole, as a nation, right, being destroyed, man. Which is a beautiful sight, man. Call Allah Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. America has been wicked for so long, man. It needs to be put to death. It needs to be, removed, right, from existence, right? And that's eventually what's going to happen, man. Right? America is going to be destroyed, But that's all I got, man. Lord will is edifying. Lord will is straight to the point. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh. Ba'ashim Yahushai, Ba'ashim Rachak Kodash. Double honors to the elder apostles, elder bishops, the elders of the great millstone. Till next time, I say shalom.